Hello and welcome to the Honest Not Perfect podcast. My name is Suzanne Ellingham and I'm the director of Source Events, the platform that helps connect retailers, brands and wholesalers to manufacturers and makers globally.
And my name is Jack Stratton. I'm director of Insider Trends. We are a global retail trend spotting agency helping brands to spot what's coming next.
Welcome to this episode of Honest Not Perfect, and we are discussing something a little bit different today. As we know, retail is a constantly changing landscape, and it seems like there's a constant drive for newness and change. However, we'd also say that despite all of this, things don't really change that fast, especially when it comes to consumer behaviour. However, one of the things that does seem to be picking up pace, and something we've seen developing over the last few years, is the movement towards preloved marketplaces and really how that second-hand market is developing. So we thought we'd invite the founder of Reskinned, Ross Barry, to talk to us a little bit more about what's happening in that space. And I think Ross can introduce himself in a second, but with over 25 years experience in recycle, reuse and the circularity space, he's incredibly qualified. So I'm delighted to have Ross, and I'll be picking his brains. But Ross, can you maybe just tell us a little bit about how your journey started? How did you go through and obviously end up with Reskinned?
So I suppose the easiest way to start is, it's a family-run business, essentially, this sort of where I come from. So my granddad, after the war, started selling lorries, and he sold a lot of lorries to one particular company in Barking. And the guy there said, "Do you want to join the business?" And their business was literally taking any textile waste from the docks in London, East London. So it'd be rope, hemp, the bags that coffee come in, wow, all sorts of everything and anything you can imagine.
What was the most random thing he found? All granddads have got the stories.
Do you know what? He probably didn't. I'll tell you some random things that my dad's found and I found, but this was, I don't know, probably a dead body, but I don't know. Yeah, this was East London docks. But yeah, back then everything did used to get recycled because it was all monofibre, it was hemp, it was cotton, it wasn't, what we've got now of polyester and man-made fabrics. So, there was a big recycling industry in the UK. A lot of it's known as the shoddy industry, which centred around Yorkshire. As it was, we was perhaps the slight exception, or my granddad was, because we was in London, and so he'd send his wool up to the auction houses, which happened every week in Yorkshire, and my granddad decided he wasn't getting the best deal because he wasn't a Yorkshireman, so took himself off to night school, taught himself Italian, so he could deal directly with Prato in Italy, which is the home of wool recycling. So my granddad was in the business. My parents actually were both croupiers in Mayfair. When my mum had me and my sister and I 11 months apart, that was the late 70s. My mum basically said, "You are not working there with all those pretty looking girls. Go and get yourself a proper job." Unfortunately, my dad had left school at 15, pretty much unqualified, so didn't want to go back to work in a scrapyard, so went to work for his dad. So he used to drive a lorry, and that was the early 80s. When things started to change, people, as we know it, would actually dispose of clothing for reasons that were fashion.
Kind of coincides with mass consumerism.
Yeah, so it's exactly the sort of, he was there at the zeitgeist, and that was what's now known as the sort of international trade in reused, pre-loved, second-hand clothing really started. Because at the same time you had massive population explosion in Africa. People think of like the mid-80s and your image of Africa very much Band-Aid, flies in the eyes, bales being dropped and donations. But you then had sort of Africa then needing clothing. There wasn't the opportunity or the price points for people to buy it, so they couldn't buy new. So this industry sort of developed whereby my dad would buy basically clothes from jumble sales. That was a massive thing, which I can't remember jumble sales, but apparently...
I can't remember the last time I saw a jumble sale.
Exactly. Apparently they're coming back.
Do you think it's like swap events?
It is exactly like a swap event, yes. He'd buy from church jumble sales every week. You'd have rag and bone men still that used to run textiles in, clothes in. And then you had the charity sector, which in some ways is a very English thing. They don't have charity shops as much on the continent. Or if you go to sort of the Nordics, it's run by the church. It's like the Red Cross.
Yeah, you see a lot more thrifting. I feel like that's more of how they term it.
So, it's sort of different. But the UK actually has always been really good at sort of reusing, recycling. So I think we've always had like a 30% textile reuse rate because of the charity sector.
Yeah.
But what you found was people were donating more clothes than the charity shop could actually sell. So they'd have big piles out back, and then what they call the rag man would come, same as they would from a jumble sale, just buy it. And then this whole industry developed, and then the late 90s, you had textile banks come out, which is something that everyone knows now because they're on every supermarket car park. But believe it or not, was quite revolutionary. And this was before you had sort of like home curbside recycling.
Yeah.
And textiles doesn't fit in with traditional recycling because it has to be kept clean and dry. You can't, like, obviously if you put a jumper in with a can of Coke, it's going to get dirty. And if you're pulling it even for fibre, then even if it's going into mattress filling, if it's got a smell on it, you don't want it. There's not the money to wash and clean it. So it's always been sort of separate from the waste industry, which I think is really important. It's something I was talking about last night with the Orr Foundation as Ghanaian group, and it's sort of the language that we use. People treat old clothes as waste, but it's not really waste, and it's just because you don't want it doesn't mean that somebody else doesn't. And I think that's the interesting thing we're finding now, especially with marketplaces. You know, it's like, just because I don't want it, I'll pop it up on eBay. Oh, look, there's 20, 30 people who are bidding for it. So it's not waste, it's just something you no longer want. So that's sort of my background. And then, you know, I think that industry's changing a lot, mainly because fast fashion has meant the traditional outlets have actually got saturated in their fall. And the rest of the world's caught up in some ways. England had this charity sector, so it sort of worked. And you've got the sort of colonial connections, the trade routes.
Yeah. So
the English sort of clothing's always been more desirable. Don't know exactly why, but it will tend to sell at about 20 to 30% premium over the French or German clothes.
Is that into those second-hand marketplaces where
so
they're being
into
sent?
sort of, Nowadays, the Nordics is really popular because it's seen as high quality clothing. So that's always happened, and then towards like the last 10 years. It's sort of, I could see that saturation had happened. It felt a little bit like I was in a blockbuster.
Yeah.
And I could see Netflix coming. So I met Matt, who's my co-founder at Reskinned, and his background's tech and advertising and sales. And, you know, at the school gates, we got talking, we'd go out for a beer, and he was sort of quite interested in what I was doing. He'd been involved in, you know, loads of different businesses, but tends to be tech-based. And he was saying, this is actually quite complicated, but I can see if you provided a tech solution, then it could open up and expand. So, you know, we got chatting and sort of decided we'd start Reskinned. That was about 2019. Got some interest. Then obviously COVID hit.
Yeah.
Which I think actually did us a massive favour.
I was going to say, because obviously at a time where things were being closed and retail wasn't as open in a physical space, I guess that's make or break for most businesses, but there's opportunity there, and it sounds like that maybe might have worked in your favour when you were getting going.
I think it definitely did, in as much as people, you know, started relying on postage and having stuff delivered at home and shopping online, but also I think people's views slightly changed. You know, suddenly there was no traffic on the road, there was no aeroplanes. It was a lovely summer, which I think helped. So everyone's sitting outside the front of their house saying hello to their neighbours, and the air suddenly seemed clear. And I think a lot of people got slightly more environmentally conscious and perhaps started questioning, you know, is this rat race what we really need now? Maybe we need to slow down. And I think, you know, you're seeing this slow fashion movement come through. And I think some of that does come from, you know, COVID. People started working from home, realising that a 2-hour commute every day perhaps wasn't the best thing for their mental health. And started looking at, should we look at changing the world? Which sounds a very big, grandiose statement, but I think that sort of did play in people's minds.
And I also wonder from that side, when we think about how things changed in the fashion space, I think there was also a general awareness of how much was being produced for British high streets. And I think it was also quite front and centre that people could see these factories in Bangladesh or India, or the people that supply into the UK, going under. And the amount of, I think it was for the first time we saw the sheer volume of how much was coming into the marketplace. And I wonder into the UK retail and how much of it was just waste. And I think during that kind of 1 or 2 year period, I think there was more in the press and just generally more around social media on how much we're producing, how much we're using. Because if all of this is still being produced and the shops aren't selling it, where does it go? And I think that's the first time I'd really seen in quite a long time. We always speak to people who are slightly more conscious, slightly more informed. But I think it was the first time I heard my mum say it. And I always think a litmus test of anything is, has my mum mentioned it to me? If she's mentioning it to me, then it is the message is filtering through somewhere. I should probably add, my mum's in her early 60s and not very social media friendly. So it means that she's seen that message come through and she said, isn't it awful what's happening with all of that stuff that people have made? And I just said to her, do you realise how much of that actually goes to waste? Like, you can see all of those big bales. Even if the shops were open, at least 40% of that is going to waste. And she went, oh, no. And I went, no, it's about right, Mum. And I think it's the first time that I saw the penny drop with her. And she's not a massive buyer or consumer. But I think that is when maybe some of the consumer behaviours that we'd been seeing in kind of the under 25s. I think that's the first time I started to see them in a slightly older generation as well. But what do you think has been the impact of that? Do you think that there is a change in shift, or do you think towards secondhand and pre-loved?
I think, yes, there definitely has been. And that's come about through sort of marketplaces and the ability for people, you can do so much on your phone on the move now, whereas before you were perhaps tied to a physical PC. But I think the whole COVID thing also perhaps made the retailers at board level realise how reliant they were on, the Far East. I think it went from something like, let's say it's $1,200 to bring a container in from China up to $9,000.
It's 12.
Yeah, that had massive impacts on their supply chain. And their business model was, buy it cheap, sell it quick, stack it high. And if you can no longer do that, you have to start looking at the fundamentals of what your brand stands for, what it does, and realise that maybe that's come to the end of its road, And I think, I hate to say it, I think there was a massive race to the bottom on price. And then Shein came out, and I think they redefined what the bottom was. And some brands maybe thought, that's not the best place to start competing. So I think you've got the consumer push. And at the end of the day, brands need to sell whatever it is they're doing and make sure that their customers are happy. But then also you had the look at, hang on, this model perhaps isn't future-proof and the world can change. And that's where the whole sort of reshoring things come on. And I think the Americans have obviously, like now Trump even more so.
Yeah.
But, this whole reliance on somebody else and realising, with the NHS and scrubs, actually this is essential. We need to be manufacturing this here because we can't be held to ransom by another government that we can't get hold of defibrillators and
I think it's
masks.
I think it's a really interesting moment in time right now, because I feel you come to some stages where there's a fork in the road. I think what Trump has done, rightly or wrongly, is maybe just like shook things up and made people actually reassess who they work with. I think there's definitely going to be repercussions for US trade, and I was speaking to a few US retailers who are already feeling it, and this was last week. But I think what it does is it gives us an interesting opportunity to get closer to our European partners. And I think we've been having this conversation within retail for a little while around your general ranging and your general mix assortment-wise. It's like how much of it should be coming from Asia at low cost? How much of that should come from closer to home? How do you manage your overall assortments and ranges? And people have been saying for a little while, we want to move more back, but the reality is it's been less than 5% to come back. It's like, right, how do we start to prioritise this? And unfortunately for UK industry, we've got some fantastic manufacturers in the UK and fantastic skill sets. But until there is this hesitancy or behaviour change around, the UK manufacturing sector can't compete with prices in India or Bangladesh or Pakistan or China. It needs to have a different brand. It needs to be known for something else. It needs to be known for quality, for skill, for smaller runs, for less waste and for circularity. And I'm seeing lots in the media and in the press at the moment, and certainly lots of people that we know within our source community are really trying to galvanise that British manufacturing sector to bring things closer to home. And I think one of the biggest reasons for that is to actually start to reduce the waste that's coming into fashion, into retail in general. So I think one of the challenges that we've had by offshoring so much of our production over the last few years is we've just ended up with an excess of stock, be it the dead stock that sits in warehouses that we don't really talk about, that nobody really likes to acknowledge. But it is also just highlighting that, especially with the EPR legislation that may come through, retailers and brands now need to be more responsible for what they make, and they need to start considering that end of life. And I think it's the first time that we've seen retailers really start to look at marketplaces and the end of life. And I think one of the questions that I'm always interested in, I think some retailers are doing this absolutely for the right reason. But I'm curious how you're seeing brands and retailers approaching that end of life. Are they open to collaborations, or where do you see it really working well?
I think when it probably 10 years ago, I started having retailers look at it, and I think that came off of the back of the vintage market.
Yeah.
Went up, and vintage seems to, every 5 years it goes up and down, and every generation gets to 17 and thinks they've invented vintage, and then it goes around again, and if you're old enough to remember it the first time, you shouldn't be wearing it.
Or you should just open your wardrobe up to your children.
Exactly. So I've I made my nephew listen to Nirvana because he had a Nirvana T-shirt on. It's like, if you're wearing the T-shirt, you've got to be listening to them, which I think that's totally fair. But yeah, sorry. We were talking where the brands are coming from. So I had somebody coming from Topshop many years ago and quite frankly said, the people at the top don't really care about end of life, but they've realised that their customers, their consumers do, and it might not be this generation, it'll be the next generation. And this was probably in like 2015, wow. So actually really right. You know, the younger generation are pushing, and they're so much more sustainably minded. If I put the paper in the wrong bin at home, my kids kill me. And that's just ingrained in their mindset, which is a great thing. And I think what you said about your mum doing it, my mum's exactly the same because, she's got the time to do it and it matters to her. I think you did have this whole Daily Mail, Jeremy Clarkson, they're just wasting time, it all ends up in a thing. It's like, but no, everyone's got to make a small step and be responsible. So I think everyone's realised, we do have one planet, and, as Mark Shayler says, you can't make money off of a dead planet.
No.
And I think cynically, some people are looking at them that way, but it is a business, and they've realised the business model might not be working. What you said, are we going to compete with the Far East on price? No, so why try? Can we bring it back? Can we, Britain's always been at the forefront of, fashion design and new styles. So let's not try and run off 100,000. You test and try it, and if it sells really well, then you go and get 100,000 made. You don't just order 100,000 and hope. And, within my industry, I've seen some, container loads of stuff turned up where the purchasers hit an extra zero and it just didn't sell. People get it wrong. It's not an exact science, and stuff happens. If everyone knew what was going to be the next big fashion, we'd all be millionaires, but we're not. So,
no, well, we're not. But I also think I would like to hope that data is driving more decisions around what could be sold. But we still see huge return rates. We still see huge volumes of waste where just too much has been produced for market. And I always think, is that the data, or is that because buyers are targeted on in margin rather than out margin, which means they just want to get the best possible deal on that unit. And rather than asking, can we sell 5,000 of them? It's like, no, we can only sell 3, but if I buy 5, I get this much. It's looking at the complete life cycle of that range. And that's an interesting conversation that we're having or hearing in retail at the moment, is around that attitude of not only a race to the bottom on getting the lowest possible unit, but actually just producing what they can sell. And the data is there, but if they're targeted on one thing, that's the one that matters. In terms of going back to marketplaces, because I could probably go off on a little tangent all on my own into that other world, what really excites you at the moment about marketplace? I mean, Reskinned is really starting to scale now, and we're starting to see more and more of it. That's got to be exciting.
Oh, I think when we set up Reskinned, we sort of wanted to make it preloved that was accessible to people that wouldn't consider it. You know, I grew up with, you know, you bought that in Oxfam. That was the,
I think
you know,
that's still the case.
and
in
there
some
still is an
people.
element. And then you get other people, you know, there's so many people nowadays saying, I'm going to go a year without buying new. And
I've just done that.
Oh, well done.
I did.
How's it going?
I slipped once.
And I think also what you're finding now, modern living means, you know, people have a smaller wardrobe. So you have to actually condense it down, which in some ways probably meant people turn it over quicker and just buy cheap. And it's like, well, I don't want to keep wearing the same thing and throw it away. Then other people saying, well, hang on, if I buy something that I know I'm going to get, you know, a reasonable resale rate. So me and Matt are slightly older generation and we're both massive petrol heads. So our analogy, which sometimes doesn't fit with other people, is, you know, if you look 20 years ago, car dealerships, Audi, Mercedes, BMW, were no way going to be seen next to a second-hand car dealership because that was very Arthur Daly, very only fools and horses. But now, look, you know, pre-approved cars is probably their biggest line.
Yeah.
Ford's business model is actually now that they rent and sell more cars that way than actually straight out sales.
Wow.
So we sort of looked at it and said, hang on, if brands can buy something that's going to last, it's got durability, it's, you know, more of a style statement than a fashion, and it lasts, and somebody will buy that as an investment and know that they're going to get 30-40% of the price when they come to resell it. That's going to be an incentive to them. And if the brands can be involved in that, then, you know, in some ways that gives them a second bite of the cherry, you know.
Yeah.
That is, you know, being able to sell something twice is great. So that's how we set up the business model, that it's a profit share and the brand receives that. And also the great thing is that the brand actually gets that customer contact so that they can then, you know, redirect people to a new purchase, which, you know, some people say, hang on, you just incentivise somebody for wasted. It's like, well, no, it's just moving it along. And whilst there is a massive lot of people that will do peer-to-peer marketplace selling, there's an awful lot of people say, my time's not worth it, I don't want to. There's always the charity sector to give it to, but, you know, everyone has different reasons for why they dispose of clothes and how they do it. And, you know, some people will always go to the charity shop. Some people will always sort of look at getting the money themselves or just give it to a friend. So, you know, it's finding something for everyone and making it easy. So we want to sort of make it as fun and as exciting buying pre-loved as it is new.
Yeah.
So, you know, we hope that, you know, our eBay store or our own stores looks good, it looks new, it's a pleasant experience. You get 30 days you can return stuff. We obviously rather people not keep returning it. But I think the great thing is we've got a very low return rate because, you know, we've invested heavily in making sure the photography's right, the description's right, the colours are right. And when you start looking at why it is that people return stuff, yes, you've got the bedrooms, the new sort of changing rooms, and you're going to buy 3 and 4 different sizes and you know you're going to send them back. But then there's also the thing that's, you know, you've bought something, the colour on screen's not what you've said it is, this sort of thing. So, you know, you've got that sort of the same as you would buying new. You've got that guarantee that it is what it says it is. But yeah, you've still got the choice and the variety.
I think it's interesting though. There's a few things I find quite interesting. The first one is I wonder if there is an attitude towards pre-loved or secondhand that you just don't return it. I don't think I would ever return something that I bought on a marketplace because I think, if you're in that behaviour, maybe you're going to wear it, but you're going to stick with it. I wonder if that adds to it, but also I like what you said around the technology, and I think you're right. A lot of people return things because it's not what they expected, or the colours weren't right, or the fabric wasn't right, and I wonder how much of that really helps drive those lower return rates. The thing I really am quite interested in is the brand relationship, because by building in those brand partnerships, what you're essentially allowing is for them to have an ongoing relationship with customers that maybe have forgotten about that piece. What's the thing that surprised you most about some of the brand partnerships or how that emerged and grew?
I think some ways surprising has been that we actually haven't had to do a great deal of outward calling. Everything's come to us, which is lovely. You know, that's a great place to be. And also, I think the thing that surprised a lot of companies early on we refused some very big brands because we just didn't think they was doing it for the right reason. So we're in that nice position that we can pick and choose slightly who we work with. And I can honestly say every brand we work with, it feels like they're doing it for the right, they're doing it because they can see that there needs to be a change. They know EPR's coming in, and that's going to affect the business model. But equally, I think they want to be able to offer their customers a different way of engaging with them in some ways.
Is there been anything... I mean, I think one of the great things about that as well is that with the type of business that you are, you have the right to pick and choose who you work with. It's the same with anyone. Often your brands and the extended partners that you work with will reflect on you and your business values as well. So are there any... I'll ask about your favourite partnership. Have you got a favourite partnership? Or is that like asking like a favourite child?
It's exactly like that. I wouldn't be able to say who my favourite is. There's certainly some brands that when it comes in, I'll go and do some shopping. But yeah, again though, it's like, I don't know, people in a sweet shop, it's like you're bored of eating sweets. Some days you just do get snowblind to it all. Yeah. Unless you happen to, the forklift sprays oil all over you and you need a new T-shirt. And then considering you just need a T-shirt, it's surprising how picky you get.
Well, I think when you've got a lot of choice, it goes that way. What do you see? Where do you see your business model or your business developing into? Because there's a lot of different places you could go. What's exciting to you at the moment?
We had it was our third birthday this year, and we had sort of had a meeting with all the team, and it's sort of like we started very much from it's take back, it's all about preloved, and now we're working with a brand a lot more to handle that dead stock problem. And that's kind of pulled us into the area of repairs. That in itself's pulled us into, I hate the term upcycling, but, that reinvention of something. If it hasn't sold, maybe if we change this, change that, which I think is really exciting. It's sort of where previously it had been quick and easy to dispose of it. People saying, well, hang on, there's something not right, but this has sold. And then you get into that sort of personalisation thing. So we just did a repair programme with passengers. So we took some of their coats, did different repairs, so they're visible repairs, which I think is a great thing that a lot of people are now doing. And that was really exciting because you've got the creativity and still sort of the consumer engagement. So I think that's a path that's really interesting. Yeah. And then also from a rather sort of more operational point of view, every single thing we sell is a single SKU, and we've set the business up to be single SKU, which causes no end of trouble. And a lot of people in retail look at us like, you're absolutely mad.
I think you might have just seen my face there.
I did. And it's like, yes. But from my background, you compartmentalise and the whole business is about triaging and categorising. But we've gone one step before it. And everything is dealt with on an individual basis, which is really interesting but very, very challenging. And it relies on the objectivity of an employee and everyone's view, lens on what's rewearable, what's new rewearable differs. And the thing that's come over in the last couple of years, and everyone says it, AI, mechanical or learning is just the speed at which it's coming about and what's happening has actually made us hold back on some projects. Because actually we'd be putting a lot of money into this, but I suspect AI will be able to find a much better solution within 6 months.
I think I've got so many questions about every part of what you just said in those 3 points. I think the first one is on the repair side, because I think we were talking earlier and we were talking about repair. It's like, it feels like it's something that should be offered or something that should be intrinsic within retail and brands for them to have that ability. And we're seeing lots of people do repair, but feels like it's more of a tick box rather than something that is actually built to be a profitable, sustainable part of their business. Do you see anyone other than yourselves doing repair really well? Who does it well?
I think it's a really difficult one because I'm slightly London-centric and I live in North London, so every other, high street does still have a traditional dry cleaners and they've got the sewing machine there. So I'm slightly surprised when people say I can't get things repaired. Yeah. But that's because I think anything above Watford's the north and, probably has got dragons. So it's that whole side of things. And also I think, My mum was not a great sewer, and I think my scout badges proved that. But if something needed repairing, she'd give it a go. And there was always my nan round the corner, who was really good and sat darning socks on a Sunday and knitted. So yeah, I think that skill set's been lost. And someone like Sojo, who do that peer-to-peer, is really good. But it's difficult to replicate because it relies on somebody taking in their clothes and, you know, they still have an intrinsic value to it. So you can look at it, you can price it, and, you know, repair's expensive. You know, it's a lot of faff, just like changing the thread on a sewing machine's hard work, and I can't do it. So to replicate it and scale it is incredibly difficult. And a lot of brands are coming in saying, we need to be offering a repair service mainly because I think the French have said you've got to subsidise it in some way, and they're like, oh, okay. But a lot of clothing wasn't made to be repaired. You know, it's fairly cheap, low-value clothing, so where's the point in putting an extra button on it, or what are you going to repair to it, and having the skill set?
It's even the alterations. It's like you can always... I think I was talking to one buyer who said, look at the hems. Have you got material left there to be able to alter, or in the seams? And in quite a lot of clothing, it's cut with the smallest possible margin. So clothes aren't really designed to be altered, not in my sense is that not so much in the high street. There's one brand that I do love who does this really well, and it's Black Horse Lane jeans.
Yep.
And I think it works because it's a slightly more expensive product, but they offer lifetime repairs. And my husband has had a few pairs of jeans from them and also took them back to be repaired as well. But at point of sale, you're aware these can be repaired, bring them back to us. This is the early sign to look for when this needs to be repaired and bring it back to us. And I mean, he's gone back quite a few times to get different purchases, but I think that's probably one of the few places where I can think that like repairs actually being done well. It's a premium piece of clothing that's been designed with that in mind, and also it builds that relationship with the customers that they know they're coming back. And I think I don't see too many retailers who are able to replicate that. Maybe in flagship stores, but it's quite a difficult thing. But I think I'm quite excited to see how that emerges, because I think it will. And I think there's places, people like Sojo and like these smaller brands who've got the flexibility to do it, that maybe there will be something, especially as consumers and younger consumers are curious about that. If they love a piece of clothing, maybe they want to keep hold of it. And I think I always often think that often the future of retail is actually back to the future. And when we look back in the time period, like 60s, 70s, 80s, where there was that scarcity, you did repair. And I wonder how much of that will come back alongside the preloved and the second-hand marketplace and the move towards vintage.
Well, I think it's, you know, what we started with was saying people are having to reassess their business models. You know, the heritage brands, you know, Barbour have always offered a repair service and never really had to shout about it because their customer base knew about it.
Yeah.
And then, you know, there's Nudie Jeans, people like that, who are building and designing knowing that they will offer repair for life. And we were talking earlier about, you know, shoe manufacturers and the British old established handmade shoes. You know, they've always taken them back. Again, never felt like they needed to advertise it or talk about it because their customer base knew it. And what we're trying, or what I think's happening, is people are reassessing this whole, you know, buy something that's better, that will last. And if that's the case, you know it's going to be repaired. You know that perhaps you might want it to be sort of adjusted and altered in future, bought in, bought out, or even just sort of completely redesigned.
Yeah.
But if it's a good quality fabric material, it can always have something altered to it and changed and reinvigorated.
And I think this alteration's going back to your last point around the dead stock and being able to personalise and bring things back to life. Obviously, Stuart Trevor's been in the press a lot for the start of his range, his clothing business that doesn't make any clothes. And that is all based around the same principle of using dead stock and secondhand and vintage and just giving it a new lease of life. How far down that road are you going, or are you looking to? Because it's such an interesting area.
That's something, again, we did a project with Goldsmiths University and they was looking at our business and different things we could do. And in some ways, the elephant in the room is we're not a clothing brand, we're not a retailer. And do we go down that route? We're doing so much work in fibre to fibre, and we're helping brands take, their materials and make new yarn, weave it. Do we do the next step and become, refabric? We're synonymous with, this has got the GRS, it's got the whole traceability into that. And also then it's sort of, do we do collaborations with young designers that, we can provide them feedstock, they do something. We do lots of work with Central St Martin's and, the young guys there are looking at, again, they're looking at it very much with a different perspective and saying, no, it's not waste, it just needs changing and altering, and that's a different design process, and it's probably not one that's taught currently. The EU have said you're not allowed to destroy perfectly good clothing. So I know the Italian luxury brands are getting together and saying, okay, if we're going to have to repurpose this, how do we do this? And their design teams have never done that. They design from scratch.
Yeah.
They don't take of something and then reinvent it, which I think something sort of through our work with St Martin's, actually also the London College of Fashion, there's a lot of focus now about waste going to Africa, Chile as well. There's a lot of, this whole market is, where is our clothes ending up? And if you look at the creativity in the global south and what's actually done with the clothing and reinvented, and this whole idea of making it their own, putting their own stamp on it and changing it is really, really fascinating. I think you could see a lot of new brands coming out of that. And also their perspective on clothing is very different to ours, which is interesting. I think there's this whole thing, like, if it's been seen on Instagram once, a lot of people won't rewear it. It's, But the idea from a lot of other, where they're not spoilt for choice as we are, and, if you buy something, it's still very much investment. So the case of, I'm going to buy something that looks absolutely amazing, and if I wear it at a wedding and then wear it at christening later, I'll probably get a local seamstress to change it and make it different. But there's no shame in having the same thing, because it's an amazing outfit, and if you look good in it, why wouldn't you wear it more than once? And it's a different mindset, and I think you're seeing that come in. Sort of a lot of people now saying, okay, I want to wear something and, be proud that I've got something special that no one else has got, which I think some ways backs up the whole sort of pre-loved thing, because, there's nothing worse turning up and somebody's got an identical shirt that they've bought in H&M as you have. If you're buying pre-loved,
chances are it's a bit unique.
Exactly. And I think that's a great way for people to buy, and it sort of goes against this whole, change it every 2 weeks, which is synonymous with fast fashion. So you don't have to, you just get something different, and there's enough out there.
Have a really good relationship with your seamstress or your tailor, or find one. I think what's really interesting around the altered and actually starting to really look at that dead stock and how we reuse it. And I could be making this up, but I promise by the time this gets released, I will have researched it. I think I remember reading somewhere there's tax exemptions or tax breaks for if you're actually using old stock as a core material. If you're using vintage, not call it vintage, old or secondhand materials to make them into your product, there's actually some financial benefits to doing that. I definitely promise I haven't made that up. I've read that somewhere about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I will put a link up on our website. But I think that's really interesting, because it shows even somewhere from a policy level, somebody has realised that actually, in order to get people looking at secondhand stock and start to get them reusing waste and pulling that back into the cycle, there's got to be some incentives there for people to do that. But much like everything, and it's the same with the Developing Countries Trading Scheme, when we talk about that, it's like a lot of people just don't know it's there. They don't know even to look at it. But I think it opens up a whole interesting, I suppose, stream of materials that I think most people don't consider. And I think you are right. I think when students go through design, it's always design from scratch. But actually, maybe it should be around design for reuse, and that should be part of design thinking.
Yeah, definitely. And just what you were saying about incentives to use old material, I'm pretty sure that if you write off dead stock, you can claim it against corporation tax. So in some ways, there's an incentive to write off stock to lower your tax bill. I'm not sure if that's true, and I'm sure a lot of accountants will put me wrong, but, this whole
Sounds
idea...
plausible.
It does, doesn't it? This whole EPR thing is saying, the free market isn't doing a great job at regulating this overconsumption, so there is going to be laws, and it's just what direction that takes, whether it's tax, But I think the very fact that people are looking at this is making a lot of brands stand back and say, do you know what, let's do how we think it should work and what works for our business model. You know, I think there's a lot of brands that are really great at durability but don't advertise it.
Yeah.
And, you know, consumers do know what lasts and what doesn't. And it's a case of, just rethinking how you buy clothes. And luckily with social media, there's a blog for everyone. And you can learn so much, or not learn, it's up to you. But, you know, the information is a lot more readily available and you're not relying on the broadsheet press to sensationalise or tell you what it is.
I think the whole issue around the dead stock, bringing things back in pre-loved marketplaces, I think it's just such an interest. For me, I'm fascinated to see how it develops, because I remember we were talking to somebody at a panel at Source Fashion and they said, you know, is our marketplaces the alternative to fast fashion? It's like, oh my God, please let them be. But you're probably seeing that. What's, for you, obviously there's lots of different elements to Reskinned and where you could go, but what do you see as your future direction? What excites you for what you're working on?
I think at the moment it is, you know, as I said, we've started very much on take back and we are handling dead stock. And I think brands are beginning to wake up and say, hang on, we've got a problem with dead stock. So that's naturally going to reduce.
Yeah.
And, you know, then the whole pre-love's going to become a much bigger thing, part of our business. But I think the exciting thing, personally, because I come from a recycling background, I just love this sort of idea of Rumpelstiltskin, you know, taking old fibre, making it new. As I say, my granddad took himself Italian. I've been back and forth from Prato, you know, and taking old jumpers, cutting them up into thousands of little pieces, pulling it back, recombing it, blending it. It's just exciting and interesting, sort of the fibre to fibre, this idea that it's an infinite resource.
Yeah.
You know, and I think with the repolymerisation, chemical recycling, you know, polyester can keep just going in a circle. It will degrade slightly, but not a great deal when you just mix a bit more in.
Yeah.
And then it's, where does this happen? You know, proximity principle, you should deal with the waste as close as possible. But yes, do that. But the truth is, at the moment, all of the manufacturing of polyesters offshore tends to be Southeast Asia. So then you're going to see, actually, well, we don't need to do that. We can then have it all done in the UK. If that's the case, a whole new industry opens up and it's, you know...
And I think we're seeing the grass shoots of that with Satcol and with their fibre-to-fibre recycling, from what I understand.
Yeah, do you know what? There's so many people out there doing it and they're at different levels, and I think... There's been a joke in the industry today. It's always 5 years away, but you're actually seeing it happen. So, you know, Renewcell, now Circulose, you know, they made a pair of Levi's that could be gone around 7 times.
Yeah.
You've got Sodra, you've got Syri, you've got Recover, of mechanical recycling that, you know, I think forgotten about. And, you know, a lot of people in the recycling say downcycling, and that's become synonymous with mechanical. It's like, no, that's not the truth at all.
I'm going to ask a silly question. What's downcycling?
So the idea within the waste hierarchy is you reduce, so buy less essentially, reuse it, then you recycle it. And the idea is that you try and make something that's a similar value.
Yeah.
So if you take a sort of coat and then pull it back to fibre and it ends up as stuffing in a mattress, that's been termed downcycling because you're making something of a lower value.
Whereas if you were making another coat.
Yeah, although... The argument is if it's going in a Chesterfield, you know, that's going to sit there for 200 years, how's that downcycling? So that's why I don't like it, because it seems to imply that you're doing something like that. And then if you take into the point that you're actually putting that fibre into something where it has otherwise been virgin, actually you're doing a much better job because you're saving that resource from being used. You're diverting it. And, you know, that's slightly frustrating because my granddad's era, there was a market for everything. There was a recycling route, but a lot of the time it's not that there's not a recycling route, it's cheaper to buy virgin.
Yeah.
Or actually, if we buy recycled, it's here and our manufacturing's over there, so we just buy, you know, it's ease.
What do you think stops more people from recycling? I'm thinking about this more from an infrastructure and a systems perspective. So do you think it's a matter of brands don't have the relationships or don't have... the awareness, or do you think it's a matter of thinking, oh my God, that just seems like a lot of work to do it that way?
I think actually, in fairness to the brands, it's not their fault as such. It's on a much bigger level that textile recycling seemed to start and finish in about 1850 and no one's really invested in it. It is still, fairly basic. It's only been the last 10 years that people have actually realised that there's a mountain sitting there, and then people have gone, hang on, if that's a mountain of waste, actually it's a resource, and looking at it as a resource and changing the way you define it, the language you use.
Yeah.
And, all of our brands, or nearly every brand, would love to go and buy a recycled fibre, but you can't. It's not commercially viable yet. And the reason for that is that you've not got the back-end infrastructure to sort and grade it and channel it where it needs to be. So there's a massive aggregation of stock issue, which is something that Reskinned does. All of our customers, it goes into a mass balance. So people love the idea of, my jumper made that jumper. Reality is you're not going to have enough volume to do that. There's very few companies that have that volume. So once you aggregate it, you can then send it off to the recycler, you can produce the yarn, the woven, and then feed it back in. And we sort of trying to, most brands do buy a garment and they don't, they know where the fabric's made. Very few know, the yarn or where that's woven. So to start getting recycled products, you need to start at the very beginning. And as everyone knows, supply chains are incredibly complicated.
Yeah.
So to try and do that is hard work. And that's part of what our business is sort of trying to hold people's hands, guide them,
process.
and do it together. And I think that's something that's also very exciting. Within sustainability, collaboration works and it's needed. And most brands, all the brands we talk to, they realise the problem's bigger than any one person can do, so they're happy to work together.
Yeah.
And I think within the food industry was very good at that. Everyone knows the love food, hate waste, and that was from the supermarket lab. And they all put their own personal sort of marketing and how they presented it, but it was very simple for everyone to understand. And I think that's hopefully what happened because, like however many different certified organic cottons there are, we don't want to be getting into a place where there's 1,001 different sort of loopholes to jump through and certifications. It's like, let's just make this simple and, we've got a chance to start again with this.
I think that's quite exciting for anyone who is interested in this space, is actually that is moving along a little bit faster than it was. And I think for me, the most encouraging thing is what you just said there, which is collaboration. We work across different parts of retail, and in many other parts of retail, there is a lot more collaboration. But fashion, for whatever reason, has always been a little bit harder for companies to collaborate, whether it was competitive conflict or whether they just didn't align. But I think behind closed doors now, a lot of the larger retailers and brands are starting to properly collaborate. And I think there's a number of case studies where they've seen actually there can be an alignment, but unless they all come together, nothing will change. And I think that's one of the more encouraging things that I've seen, even in the last 2 or 3 years that we've been running Source, is the attitude to collaborate and share more insight is something that is prevalent now. It's becoming more accepted that they can do that, even if it's not out in the open, out in the press. There are the working groups where they do work together.
Yeah, I don't know the supply chain, but there's been so much focus on workers' rights and conditions, and it does seem ridiculous that you've got 20 people all auditing the same factory, so they might as well collaborate. And it's the same here. If you're going to be responsible for everything you put out and have to find a solution for end of life, makes a lot more sense and it's a lot cheaper and a lot easier. Because, nobody wants to be doing that. Yeah. Well, I'm sure there are some people, but maybe we just leave them in a back room somewhere.
Oh, well, I hope. So I'm going to ask you one last question, and then we can wrap up. Where do you see the biggest, outside of Reskinned, what's the thing that you're most interested to see develop? What's the thing that you think, well, that's not something I'm looking at right now, but that could be super interesting for the future?
Probably not. I don't know.
Is it?
I just think from the little bit that I've seen on machine learning and sort of avatars and that sort of thing, the photography side of things and the knowledge. And I think something that we're really looking at too, product passports is a big thing.
Yeah.
But it's like, there's so many interesting, exciting things that you can do. And I think somebody very clever is going to come along and there's just going to be a light bulb moment. It's like, hang on, they've just changed it completely. And I think, that sort of knowing from where something's manufactured, and it's all about, what date do you put in, you put rubbish in, you get rubbish out, but then also being able to track a clothing that the first time that someone's worn it, second, then it comes back to us, it gets sold again, then it gets recycled, and, there's going to be sort of tech that's in the yarn that then traces that along the supply chain. And I just think something there's...
That life cycle technology.
Yeah, but also I think somebody's going to think of something really clever marketing-wise, and it's something I just got a feeling something's going to change on, people's relationships with clothes now is very different to what it was in the sort of 60s. I was talking to somebody last night and he said, he went to work as a graphic designer and didn't wear a suit, but if you walked through London in the 70s, everyone had a Burton's grey brown suit, looked the same. And I said, when I started work in the mid and late 90s, you still saw old people with bowler hats. If you walk into the city now, you see a lot of gilets and three-quarter length zip-ups, but
it's just a new uniform.
Yeah. But it's sort of like, it's a uniform with brand, but, sometimes it's just a case of, let's just make life easy for ourselves. Let's wear a uniform during the day. It can be variations. That then makes it really easy to recycle. And if we're doing fashion, if we're going out making a statement, invest in those pieces and do it properly. Don't just keep trying to be, I've got a new outfit today every day of the week. That's hard work for anyone. So just make our lives a little bit easier.
I think I love that. We spoke to Hayley Shaw. She was in yesterday, and she's a design head over at Pepsi. And what she left with is, we just need to do less of everything. So we just need to work less, we need to produce less, we need to think less, just life needs to be easy. And that feels like it's a little bit of let's make life easier.
Yeah, I'm fundamentally lazy, so if anything can make life easier, I'm all up for it.
That feels like a really great place to finish. Thank you so much, Ross, for coming and for sharing your insight. I don't think there's many people that we speak to that know as much about this space as you do. So I know your insights to people who listen are going to be really, I think, maybe some light bulb moments there as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.